Today we're at St. John's Catholic Church, just west of Montgomery, a couple of miles. And the purpose for today is we want to, first of all, talk about the immigrants and the sacrifices they made to come to America and to come to this place, and to their desire to have a place of worship and the challenges it took and the sacrifice it took for them. So we want to talk about that. And then we're also going to talk about the history of the church, its original position where it was located, the original church, and then the current one that was reconstructed partially from the old church. So I think we'll start inside. We'll go inside and take a look in the church and talk about its history, and then we'll go from there. So come on in. Okay, I'm out at the St. John's Church, Catholic Church, which is about 2 miles west of Montgomery, established in 1868. And we're here to talk about the church, its founding, and to begin with, we're going to talk about the people that took the risk to come here from, most of them from Bohemia, who took tremendous risk and sacrifice every step of the way of their journey, which was extremely difficult. So I think we start with them. So if we go back to the mid-1850s to the late 1850s, that was the period where the immigrants, the first strong wave of immigrants came to Minnesota. And again, St. John's is located west of Montgomery, about 2 miles, just to give you an idea of proximity. So when the first ones came, initially, of course, we started in Bohemia, which was Bohemia and Bavaria, which is Germany is an area where Bavaria is, and Bohemia is an area in Czechoslovakia. They were border areas, so they bordered. The people were dealing with the same things. They were dealing with the government that was still practicing monarchism, and in monarchism, the practice of feudalism. So the people were never allowed to own land. They were dedicated a plot of land by the lords, the landlords. They were dedicated a plot, and they were never able to extend or increase their land. You could never own it. So as generations came forward, you had to divide that plot up even smaller. So you were very restricted. And one thing in reading a lot of the documentaries from that era, and in all these little literature books, one thing that I found very common, a common comment, is that the people were hungry. And being hungry is a very good incentive to do something. So the other thing with feudalism, you were required to, in a lot of the areas, you were required to give the Lord 52 days a year. So 1 day a week you had to dedicate to Him, and there was no compensation for that. So the only areas that were available for the common people to do, to try and attempt to grow crops or for have their livestock forage, was the lowlands. It was very poor quality agricultural land, and then the wooded areas where they allowed hogs to forage in the woods. So things were very difficult. At the same time, in these areas, these feudal systems, there would be skirmishes that would come up. And if you were conscripted to fight, you were conscripted for 10 years. After 10 years, you had a 3-year extension where you could be called up. And in the 1850s, there was rumblings of war. The people were hungry. It was food shortages. And in that time, there is an unbelievable story about a place called America. And that if you came to America and you worked hard and you cleared the land, you could actually be deeded from 80 to 160 acres that would cost you virtually nothing. What strikes me about it is these people did not believe their government at all. They didn't believe anything that was told to them. Even their plot of land that they leased could be taken from them at any moment. There was no guarantees. You had no protection from courts. But yet, this message coming from America, for some reason they believed it. And it just strikes me because their whole life they could never believe governments. But this message of free land, they bought it. It just really is quite remarkable. But as I thought about it, I thought it's a great gamble. And one thing these people were, they were risk takers. It was a great gamble because if it wasn't what America is saying, they couldn't be any worse off than they were. But if it's true, they would take a giant leap in the way they lived their lives. So many of them took the leap. But you know, they were also really not allowed to dream in their country. They couldn't dream because there was no way to further yourself. But yet they were dreamers, and they were dreamers, and that remained with them. So when the word of this free land was so compelling that many of them took the risk. So to begin with, they had to find a port to embark onto these ships. Prior to 1850, you took a sail ship to come to America, which was extremely difficult. From 1850 on, the steamships were rolling and made the trip a lot more convenient. They were bigger. It was a little simpler. So we'll go from my great-great-grandfather came here in 1848, so he probably was on the sail ship. And it was, in the notes that I have, it was an 11-week journey. I think there was a layover in one island, for sure, where they resupplied. But we'll start from 1850 when the steamships started taking immigrants over. When you embarked on the steamship, you were going to either be in first class, second class, or in steerage, it was called. And that was the low, we'll call it the basement of the ship, where the steerage was for controlling, steering the ship, and that was also storage. That's where third class people would stay, and that's where the bulk of them were. If you were in first class, you had your own cabins. Second class was much more convenient, and third class was basically in the storage compartment. So when they came, we've all seen the chests, these old chests, we've seen them a time or two during our life. That was basically all an individual could take. So what you put in there could very much impact your life here. If you were a carpenter, you put in your tools, your most valuable tools. You would put them in there before you put in clothing, because they were going to be an advantage for you. Craftsmen that came to the United States were the ones that were allowed to advance to the West quickly, because they needed them to develop the new country. So your chest was what you took. You put in your most valuable things, and that's all you had. When the existence on the ships, when they were coming over, was extremely difficult. It was wet, it was damp. Men set up systems to protect young girls and women, because there were some unsavory characters in there too. So they have to develop that, figure that out by themselves. But then if typhoid and cholera a lot of times was a disease that followed with them. You can imagine in a damp container like that, and disease is a perfect breeding ground for the disease to spread rapidly, and sometimes it's dead. And if that happened, a lot of people were buried at sea. They had to do it quickly to prevent further spread. So that's the conditions they lived in coming over. With the steamship, depending where you disembarked, it could be a 2-week to 4 or 5 week journey. So they make this journey, and none of them have been on the sea. And the difficulties of their existence, can you imagine going to the bathroom, and there was very little ability to to clean yourself, to shower, or so that was all that they had to contend with on the way over. Then when they get here, 70% of all immigrants disembarked in New York City. So this is, now Ellis Island didn't start operating until 1892, so these were pre-Ellis Island. They disembarked on a place called Castle Garden, which is on the very tip of Manhattan. When they disembarked, they were quickly being observed. If anybody was walking with a limp, or if it looked like you needed assistance, you were in trouble. Also, they did simple inspections, health inspections. They, at that time, obviously couldn't diagnose much at all, but they had a few things they checked for. So you had to pass, and when you walked off, when you disembarked, you were being observed immediately to see your walk or your gait. Then you had this inspection, and there's a story. This one comes from Ellis Island. I was there and did the hospital tour. This happened in 1894. There was a family of 9 from Sweden came over with grandma. The 8 of them were allowed to come through. They passed the inspection, but grandma had a growth on her thumb. And again, they couldn't diagnose much then. They didn't know what it was. They were fearful that it could be a communicated disease. So grandma was refused entrance. She immediately was shipped back, and they all knew full well they would never see her again. So that's kind of the difficulty coming over. If the other thing, if you got through inspection, if you were going to go west, you had to show means of getting there. In other words, you had to be able to finance your trip to the west. If you couldn't, you were stuck on the East Coast. And of course, hundreds of thousands of immigrants are coming, which meant there was virtually no jobs. They were filled up quickly. And the jobs they did have to take were menial, working in sewers. They were terrible jobs. But those that had means and those that were craftsmen were allowed to come west quicker because they were going to help grow the country. Anybody that was going to be a hindrance, even a single woman coming over or a child, if they didn't have a spouse or a parent, they were not allowed entrance because they were considered a burden. And at that time, a small fledgling country could not afford any burdens, so you just simply got refused. I think up until probably 1900, 125,000 people were refused entrance, and 3,500 people died in Ellis Island from 1892 to the early 1900s. So if you had an illness and they thought they could help you, you would be hospitalized for a period. If you recovered, you may get in. If not, you were sent back. So we have these people who lived through very hard times where they came from and take this immense, difficult journey to come here and still were optimistic. I think to understand these people, I think they were prepared for this because of the existence they had where they were. It was tough. And so these people were very stout people, and they were prepared for this enduring, difficult trip. If you would take people today and attempt to do this journey, I don't think you'd get any participants or very few, but they had the training. I think a comparison can be made to World War II. The soldiers that fought there had the training of the Depression, which was extremely hard times. They were prepared for the difficulty. That's how I view the immigrants that came here. So they get to New York and they get through. Some of them took to the Great Lakes to make their way to Milwaukee, to Chicago. And if you got there, Some of them, if you had means, they could buy a horse or two and maybe even a wagon and continue their journey. Some of them maybe could just buy a horse. A horse was, in the 1850s, was $150, which is a tremendous amount of money. Otherwise, you had to find other ways. You had to walk, and some of them did. And even if you had means with a horse, you had to traverse trails, Indian trails, because there were no roads. There had no roads been built yet. And from Wisconsin to the area we call Budejovice here would have been difficult, and it would have been all forest. I should just back up a little bit. As I say, this is the area they call Budejovice. The immigrants, when they came here, they came from a city of Budejovice in Bohemia. It's in southern Bohemia. So many of the immigrants came from that southern region, and they wanted something to remember that would be similar to where they came from, and this reminded them of that. So that's why this became the area of Budejovice. So, so they make their journey here, and then they discover on the way that there were other people living here. Again, they didn't know any of this, and they were Native Americans, and some of them were happy to see them, or they certainly got along very well, and some of them weren't sure, because these are new, strange people that they had never encountered before. So they have to negotiate that too. And then they get up here, and the land agent takes them to their property, and this area of Leesure County, which we're kind of in the middle of, just maybe a little bit on the eastern side, was all the big woods. The big woods extended for about 150 miles from north of the Minneapolis-St. Paul down to Rochester, and about 40 miles wide. And it was a forest. It was a hardwood forest. So they come to their location of their land claim, and they're in a forest. And now they have to cultivate land to grow crops, because they had to do that immediately. It was vital for their existence. So depending on when they got here, if they got here in the spring, which I think a lot of them tried to do, it gave them time to cut down the hardwood trees and to use the logs to build a log cabin, which was absolutely necessary to get at that right away, so it was prepared for the winter. If you came a little later, and even those that came in the spring, a lot of them would build a dugout into the ground and then put some kind of a roof assembly above it so that they were prepared for any bad weather, winds and that kind of thing, because living in a tent wouldn't cut it. So that's what they had to do to get started. They cleared the land, and the agreement with the government was that if you cleared 5 acres of land, 5 acres of woods, and got it under cultivation, you had 5 years to do it. The other way you could achieve the land is that if you lived on it, you didn't even have to cultivate it, but if you could prove you lived on it for 5 years, you also would achieve that success. So they get here and they start that, and then again, the Native Americans were here, and some of them were not terribly excited about these new people. So they had to be a little bit cautious. And you got to keep in mind, they're in a forest. So your nearest neighbor might be, 3 miles away, and you may not even know he exists. So you're out here all by yourself. There are no towns, there are no railroads. You're on your own. So that made it a little bit uncomfortable, especially for the women. But they get going, and and things are they're progressing. A lot of them are successful, although 40% of the immigrants from 1840 to I think the 1900s or shortly later, 40% of them did return to the homeland. Things were just too difficult. And of course, when they leave their homeland, they're leaving everybody behind, their family, their history, everything that was common to them, they left behind. So for some of them, that was difficult. But they start progressing, and they're an optimistic bunch. And then then this is amazing because they come here, they're here about, a lot of them about 3 years. And in 1861, we all know what happened. The Civil War began. And in 1862, the Indian uprising in New Ulm occurred. So this is where if I was an immigrant and I'd be reflecting back on the promise of America, when I'm back in my home country and there was rumblings of war there, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to get out. They were also persecuted, religiously persecuted. And then I come here and I'm here 3 years and now they got a war going. Exactly what I tried to not be involved in. So the burden of just getting started here and clearing the land and staking a claim was one thing, but now you have the Civil War, and 25% of the immigrants fought in the Civil War, so there were men who had to leave and made it difficult on the people that were left behind. And then the Indian uprising in '62, these are all going at the same time. There were men that were asked, and I know a story from a local farmer out here that talks about his relatives. The last name was Rinda, and Rindas were some of the very first settlers here. Talks about a story of the government had asked them to come and help quell the Indian uprising in New Ulm. Now, the Rindas were close to the Indians. Lloyd Rinda tells me a story about his grandmother actually speaking Sioux, because there was a little Indian encampment. Pepin Lake is one of the lakes that is close here, and it was a small lake right off of Pepin Lake called Eckert's Lake. We called it Yurok's Lake. Just to the west of that, there was an Indian encampment there. And Lloyd, Rinda's grandmother, as a child, they played with the Indians, they worked with each other. So they're being asked to go down there and quell the uprising. The group of men started their trip down there, and they're talking about this as they go, and they get part of the way there, and they decided, we don't have any quarrel with the Indians. Why are we doing this? So they turned back and came back. But those are the things they had to deal with in the 60s, compounded. They came here trying to settle a place, difficult times, and then compounded that with the Civil War and the uprising. So not much really got developed from that period till really after the Civil War. Things kind of just stalled out, as wars have a tendency to do. Progress and innovation stalls, and it all goes to the war effort. After the war, 1865, that's when and I think the experience they went through, just their experience coming here, the early experience they had here, it really tested their faith. And so after the war was over, they began to talk about churches and a place to worship. And that became preeminent for them because, boy, you just got done with the Civil War. You really don't know what's coming next. So faith became very, very important. So they began to talk about churches. And early on, another one of the early settlers was Frank Marishka, and it's the house just to the west of the church, just probably 500 yards from the church. That is not the original house. The original one would have been logged. Frank Marishka, the first priest, they did services in his house. And that went on for a couple of years. It was also like a trading post, and they did hold dances there. So it was kind of the center of activity for this area. So they had services there for a couple of years, and then the talk was about building a church. So in 1868, they began to build the first church. And the first church was located just to the north and west of this church, still in the cemetery. This church is centered in the cemetery. The first one would have been just to the north and west. And when you go out there, you can actually see the depression in the ground where that first church was. So they began to talk about it in late 1886. I think it was actually completed in 1869. They built the church and completed it. One of the one of the craftsmen that was here was a man named John Schleiss, and another man named Albert Schleiss. They were the ones. It says they were given the contract, so I think they were paid something. They were the ones that contracted to build the church. So they completed the church, and the first priest that came out here was Father Plutt from New Prague. Then this church became a missionary church of Heidelberg. Heidelberg was a little bigger, and so this was a mission church. When the priests came out here, you have to keep in mind they either walked, or they were on horseback, or they had a buggy. But some of them just had to walk. So it was difficult. Services varied. Obviously, if it was a bad winter, they probably didn't occur as much, because they were still using trails, and there were no snowplows, so if you got 2 feet of snow, it stayed there a long time. But anyway, they did manage to begin to have services here. The people that were involved, what strikes me when I sit in this church and observe the pews and the windows, it strikes me that the people that fought, and the men that fought in the Civil War, and the women, there were women involved too, they graced their hands on this church. They touched the pews, they opened the windows to let the fresh air come in. So there is definitely a sense of their presence to me when I walk in here. It's really quite a hallowed place. So then things really happened quickly. So 1869 they have their church, and then the talk was about a railroad coming. There was railroads, I think the first one was in the 1850s between St. Paul and St. Anthony. It was in the Twin Cities. But there was definitely railroads coming. They were going to come to the rural area, so that talk began. When that talk began, areas began to scramble. They started to plot the city and plot properties for houses, because they wanted to be attractive, so that when the railroad's looking, they would see that and they would locate there. They put the depot there. When a depot got put down by the railroad, that's actually where the city would be. So there was a lot of plotting. Heidelberg had areas plotted. Ruhland had areas plotted. And so that was occurring very quickly. Okay, so we're talking now about the period of the 1870s when railroads were being talked about, and railroads were freedom. It really allowed people to move and to go quickly, and to actually take a trip to Minneapolis and back in the same day. With horse and buggy, that was a week trip. But it was concerning to the local people, because they wanted that railroad to come through where their area was, because it would have meant great prosperity, and the city would grow. So cities began plotting them, trying to attract the railroads. They had a basic idea. They were land speculators buying up land. The railroad was granted, I think, 20 million acres throughout the country. It was granted to them by the government to put railroads in, because the government wanted the westward movement. They wanted things to develop. So, and even out here, just to the east of this church, probably a quarter mile, there was a trading post and a post office back then, and they were trying to be the location too. If you line up the trading post that was just to the west of here, if you line it up with Heidelberg, you line it up with St. Benedict, and you line it up with Jordan, you get a straight line. And every one of those locations were trying to lure the railroad, and that looked pretty appealing. But as it was, the railroad came 2 miles to the east of here in what is now Montgomery, and that happened in 1877. Also in 1877, Montgomery was chartered as a city. So that was, that was a negative for the area of Budejovice out here. The city began to develop. They put the depot in, and then things moved extremely rapidly. When this city was started, it was unbelievable. I wish I could have been alive at that time, because there was tremendous speculation. There was a city being built. You look at Montgomery, just like every typical little town, you see these great brick structures, very architecturally done extremely well. They were being put up very quickly. If you look in Montgomery, basically the main street as it is now was built from approximately 1896 to 1906. And if a person from 1900 would come back and look at it now, he'd virtually see the same thing. There were some stores that added on the south side, but basically be looking at the same buildings. So it really got built up that quick. And the speculation was tremendous. There were people that speculated on a building. They put up a building and then hold it for a year or two and sell it, and there was no problem selling it. Because nobody knew, was the town going to be another Minneapolis? How big was it going to get? And so they all wanted to get in front of that. But as that grew, in 1881, the Catholic Church in Montgomery, the people of Montgomery, there were 35 Catholic families at the time, decided they wanted to have their church over there because it was too far of a distance to be coming out to here, and they were now living in the city. So in 1881, the first wood frame church, Catholic church in Montgomery, was built. And that church sat right in front of the parish house, the current parish house in Montgomery. It was right in front of it, and it was facing east. When that occurred, the last entry in our history books of a priest being out here was 1881. So that was when this, it didn't cease to exist. They still did have some services out here, but it was definitely on the decline. Now the cemetery, St. John's Cemetery, continued to be the primary cemetery, even for Holy Redeemer. That was the name of the new church in Montgomery. Even as that grew, this still remained the primary cemetery. I think it was 1898 when Calvary Cemetery when that was plotted out, and that's right in Montgomery. So until then, this still was the primary cemetery. I do believe, I read a little article about St. Michael's, which is out closer to Kilkenny, Minnesota, south of Montgomery. The cemetery still exists. There was a church there too. They were closed in 1915, or it was closed up. It had been closed actually from also about 1880. But in their writing, they do talk about they were allowed to have like some services, and that would have probably been funerals, maybe a wedding, maybe a baptism. And I think that's what also occurred here. Because in 1914, the original church to the west of us was raised and a new church was built. So when you think about that, this had been not being used as often. The new church in Montgomery had been there, almost 30 years, but they were able to raise this church and build a new church. It sounds kind of illogical, but that does tell me that they were still using it. And the way it is now, cemeteries are sovereign. The churches cannot touch their assets. So I don't know if it was that way then, but I do know it would have been very difficult to close this with the immigrants that built it and them still alive. They would have been insistent that they still have activities here. So in 1914 it was raised, and the story is that they disassembled it and used some of the materials to reconstruct this church. One thing that was added was that the altar, the bump-out altar, didn't exist before. That was added. And it was extended lengthwise, I think, a little bit, but I don't think a lot more. that was the big thing I suppose the altar allowed for more room too. So they completed the church, and there's kind of two stories. One was that it was raised and reconstructed here. The other one was it was raised, disassembled, and this church as we see it now was built in the same place. And there's some validity, there's some logic to that, because the way you got out here was the roads were not as they are now. So from the intersection to the north of our church, the road going to the east did not exist, a portion of it. About, I don't know, maybe a mile or so to the east, the road actually cut across the field and then came across the north side, right along the north side of the cemetery, and then came right along the east side of the cemetery. The road in front of our church here did not exist. So there is some logic to building it there, because it would still been facing the road. It faced to the west. The doorway into the old church faced west, and there was no road in front. And by the way, a church facing west is the correct way. They always talk about it facing east. But actually, when you're at prayer in a church, you should be facing east. So actually, the opening to the church should be facing west, so that you're facing the altar. So when you're in prayer, you should be facing east. Now that practice did not hold true, actually, a lot. But now if you look at Heidelberg Church, that is exactly the way that one was positioned. So to me, and then, so I began to think about it, because I got some new information, and that's kind of the way it was told to me. And so I thought about it. I'm at home and I'm thinking about it. How would they move the church if there's gravestones all over? Except there is none over here. There's none to the south. So it actually would have been pretty simple. They could have taken it out, brought it around the west side, and they would have been in position at that point if they took it straight out and turned. You got the doorway facing like it is now, brought it across, and parked it here. So there are two theories on it. Another one is the location where the old church is. There's several pictures of it. That's the old church from, I would say, the early 1900s. Most of them are, because you can see a lot of gravestones. But I've never seen a picture over there of this church. Never seen a picture. So there's some validity to the argument that that it got moved from over there. So they moved it, and that was in 1814. And from that period on, it was allowed again to have some services. I know actually some people that have come forward and said that a priest had a couple of weddings out here and even a baptism. So I think, I'm not certain about this, but I think in the Catholic faith, to do that, I think technically you're supposed to have the approval of the bishop, so I'm not sure how that all works. But so St. John's, so we get to that point, and now St. John's is, it's lost a lot of its luster, but it remained very, very precious to the early people. And I think one good example of that is Jerome Schleiss, who was a descendant of the Schleisses who built this church originally. He had a special devotion to this church. And I know at least 2 times, and it may have been more, he scraped the church and painted it all by himself. And there were several people like that. Blanche Silmer is another one that had she was the local historian of Montgomery. She had a lot of connections here too. So when I was trying to assess, again I'll go back to that church, the old church. And if you come into the front of this church, as you come in the driveway, there is a steel gate or sign, and it's written in Czech, I am the way and the life. That gate, I always thought that's where it would have been. The old pictures of the old church, it's just a wood gate, very simple. So this is another one that leads me to think it was over there. So I thought, well, if I measure because that gate is still out in front, it got moved and Jim Corbel put it in concrete. So I thought if I measure from the tube ends, the tubular construction from one end to the other, and I go over to the old church where there was little concrete pads that are still there with conduits sticking up. I thought if I measured them, it may confirm that gate. And so I measured it out there, went over there, it measures absolutely identical. So that gate, also I've never seen in a picture from over there, but I suspect, I'm quite certain that's what it was. When the road got redone and the church was moved, there's a gate to the north here. And that they had a kind of a driveway that came in. That was an access to bring for funerals, to bring the body in, and that became the primary entrance. And because this got closed up, there was no entrance there, just a fence. So measuring that old gate confirmed, I believe that's where that sat. So we go for a number of years. There's people that, this church has been a place of controversy, and it's been a place of great healing. I think it's very spiritual, and I think that is because you have this little church in the center of a cemetery. You don't see that often. Churches could be miles away. But because it's here, it just has a special spirituality to it. It has had controversy. In the early beginnings, Frank Marischka, the neighbor to the west, he deeded the property over for the cemetery with the condition that some of the family members have a plot. And I think it was Father Plutt at the time when he came here, he denied that. He wouldn't let it happen. Must have been a verbal agreement. And it so affected Frank that he actually left the Catholic faith, and it affected his children after that. So that was a very controversial moment. Then there was an event, we got the date pretty well narrowed down. There was a break-in in the church and things got stolen. In the church we have Stations of the Cross. There are only 8 here. There are 14 Stations of the Cross. They were all stolen and removed. Also, 2 statues. One that dates back to at least 1914. One of St. John the Pomic. He was declared a saint, and he was from Bohemia, so he was a special saint. That was stolen, and I believe the other one was a statue of the Blessed Virgin. Those were not recovered. In all, 9 Stations of the Cross were recovered. 8 of them are in here. 1 of them exists at Holy Redeemer in their artifact room. I find it interesting because they're numbered, Roman numerals. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 on the north side, and then we've got 11, 12, 13, 14 on the south side. It's remarkable that we have that kind of order. And then the 5th one, number 5, is the one that's located at Holy Redeemer. So these controversies that happen, and then we had an individual who really found spirituality. There was Greg Thomas. He was suffering from terminal cancer. He has passed away, but he lived just to the south and west of here. And he would walk over here with his dog, sit at the steps and pray. And he found a peaceful serenity when he came here, and it became spiritual for him. He is not a Catholic, but he found this a special place. And so he just began restoring it. There were beams under the church floor that were sagging. He crawled under there and reinforced it. He had the building repainted, and the interior, as you see it now, he restored that. And so he had a significant impact. And in the end, it became a little controversial. Some members thought that maybe he was going too far with the restoration, that it wasn't, wasn't going to be, period. So, but in all these events, in between them, you get these events of tremendous spirituality that he felt, and that back when the Civil War veterans were here, this became quite a hallowed place because of the experiences that they saw during the Civil War. So you have these events, and my feeling is we haven't seen the last of this church yet. It just seems like time will pass, and it's quiet, and then events happen here. So it's just a very, very special place. And that's kind of the story of the immigrants. I find the immigrants, they were a very strong faith. The German and Czechoslovakian people were a very strong faith, and it's the reason they were able to pursue this journey and to be successful here. So I don't know if we have some people here. If there's any questions, now would be a good time.
I think you did a wonderful job explaining it to everyone, and which makes it very valuable to the parishioners all around. So it's just interesting, and you're a very knowledgeable individual to share your information. And
I got to tell you a little story. This just occurred too. We had the consulate from the Czech Republic. He is stationed in New York, came through here with a group of people. He wanted to see this place. And he was in here, and we were looking at cemetery stuff. Jim Corbell, who's in charge of that, was showing him. And I said to him, "Would you like to ring the bell?" And he gave me a peculiar look. And Jim said, yeah, why don't you ring the bell? And he was very, very cautious. He took the rope in the back. I said, "You don't have to pull it very hard, it'll ring." He started ringing the bell, and he looked around at the people with this great look of joy. And later I discovered that you don't get to ring a bell in Czechoslovakia. They're big bells, you have to be trained. They do what they call first full circle ringing, which you really have to be trained. You could actually hurt yourself. So for him to pull this simple bell, it's not something he'd ever done before. It was a great joy. That was just a kind of a little experience to add to the story. Talking about Jim Corbell, who manages the cemetery, he told me he found the oldest grave out here, and it was 1871, and it was a Marishka. That is the oldest grave. There are several Civil War veterans buried here. And then he really had an interesting statistic. There are over 100 unmarked, unidentified graves in the cemetery. That seems hard to believe. And they're all kind of in the old section to the north of the church here. But, the way the law was, and I think it was 1894, when the government said you had to document graves. In other words, if you buried somebody, you had to document who it was, date of birth, when they died. But before that, you didn't have to. You could literally bury people, in your backyard. And I'm sure there are people that are buried nobody knows about. Well, that's what happened here. So you have a cemetery. That's where you buried people. You got to go back to 1870. Times were different. I'm sure you could have came in here and you would hand dig the grave yourself, and you'd bury whether it was a child or a loved one. And that was that. So it's kind of, with all of this, even when you go back to the early immigrants, you have to keep everything in context, because now it would make sense. It just adds to the history and what it was like in the early days, and how life had to be lived. Life was difficult in 1870. They were still trying to settle this area. So some of those could have been pre-cemetery, died in They came here in the late 50s. So people died between, there was a 10-year period before the church was built and the cemetery was dedicated. Some of those could have been transferred from another grave, a grave that would have been near somebody's cabin or something. And that could account for why they're not identified. But I thought it was quite a large number, over 100 people that could not be identified. So I think one thing, America became the most powerful nation in the world in 200 years, and there's governments that have been around for thousands of years, just 200 years. The immigrants are the reason why. Because the people that we got here, the immigrants we got here, we got the most stout people. We got the risk takers. You had to be a risk taker to take on what they took on. And they continue to be risk takers. So it is for them that America has been as successful as it has been. During the Civil War, 23% of the immigrants fought in the Civil War. They were an interesting thing about that. When the Civil War started, the immigration slowed down to a trickle. Yeah, why would you come here? They're all fighting each other, they're killing each other. Civil War was brutal. But after about a year went by, the realization was all the men had left their jobs. And immigrants, they wanted to succeed in the worst way. So during the war, the immigration came back to pre-war levels, and they came to fill jobs and to actually fight in the war. You could pay a bounty in the Civil War, and the immigrants were the ones that took advantage of it. So if you were a person with means, you could pay an individual $300 to take your place, and you wouldn't have to fight. Many of the immigrants, including the Schleiss that came over here to build this church, took advantage of that. So he came back after the Civil War with at least $300 in his pocket, and you were buying land for $3 to $5 an acre. And that's what they were after. They wanted to be successful, and they took any means they could to get there. $3 to $5 an acre is what they paid for the land, and enhanced their lifestyle tremendously. So these people America would not be what it is without this wave of immigrants that came over and made this country great. So it's a wonderful story. I appreciate the ability to tell it. So thank you.
Thank you, Dale Ruhland from Montgomery, Minnesota. Thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you very much. Very interesting story. Okay, we're out in the very west side of the cemetery. We've completed our discussion about the early immigrants and the history of our church. And so where we are now is where the old original church sat. Where I'm standing is in the middle of the gate. This would have been the gate where you had entered into the church. The concrete plat sections here is where the gate that's out in the front of the cemetery now we're located. So as I step in, the church was very close to the gate. That church was, as you can see this depression in the ground here, the church would have probably, the west side of it would have started here and then gone in that direction. And that was again in 1868. So the road came where this bean field is now, would have come across here, went across the north side of the cemetery and then back to the east. So this is where they would have pulled up with the horse-drawn buggy and the body and would have been brought into the front of the church. This is the front-facing part. This was correctly oriented for the time. The church, the opening to the church where you entered should have faced west, so when you're in your pews praying, you're facing east. So, that is our conclusion of our investigation of St. John's. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.